All right, folks, I guess we can get started. My name is Carol Anthony. I'm from the Center for Peace and Justice Education and also from the Martin Luther King Planning Committee. So I am delighted to have you all here, and even more so delighted to have Dr. Will Horne from the ACS program, give his presentation for the Freedom School session. We've had an incredible variety of sessions today, and this is, one of the ones I've been looking forward to the most. So thank you, Will, for being here, and everybody else.
Thank you. Cool. That's me. And I want to thank you for coming today. I'm here to tell a story about the ways Black radicals responded to racial capitalism. And I especially want to think through what we mean when we say equality and inequality. And so to answer those questions, I want to draw on several examples from emancipation through the civil rights movement. These examples show patterns in white supremacy and the Black freedom struggle, from which we can imagine how best to create a more equitable future. To help make sense of this story, I'm going to share a few slides where we'll examine the ideas of several generations of Black intellectuals. During that time, I'll occasionally pause and ask you to jot down some thoughts that we'll use to inform our discussion later. And then finally, I'll close with a few observations of my own, and we'll have a chance to talk. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can all see the slides. Great. And so there's three themes that I want us to sort of pick out from Black radical responses to racial capitalism across time. And those three generally are land, representation, and equal protection. I'm starting this story in 1868, although we could start it way earlier, or we could start it way later. But I think you'll see that a lot of the themes are pretty consistent across time in terms of the ways that Black intellectuals have responded to white supremacy and tried to imagine a more equitable future. The reason I started in 1868 is because it's right after the end of enslavement legally in the US. And in the 3 years between 1865, when slavery formally ends, in 1868, white Southerners try to put together sort of a piecemeal version of slavery through the Black Codes, which are sort of infamous laws that they pass that are really meant to make Black Americans fully legally second-class citizens, make sure they can't even move around freely, make sure that they don't have a guarantee to their wages. And so for those first couple of years after emancipation, white former enslavers wound up stealing Black workers' wages. Black workers resented this, and they organized in 1867 and 1868 to keep that from happening. That organization is complicated. There's a lot that goes into it, but what winds up happening is that Black Americans in the American South get the right to vote. And so in 1868, they do that. There's a lot of violence that comes along with that as white Southerners try to prevent Black formerly enslaved people from voting. But ultimately they succeed. They elect many formerly enslaved people to state legislatures and to Congress. And so it's weird, I think, for many of us who grew up with sort of an overview of American history, thinking about this issue of voting and Black representation in the 1860s being realized, being successful, because that's a story we tend to associate with the 1960s, with what we call the civil rights movement. And in 1868, across the American South, and I'll look at Louisiana in particular, because that's where most of my research is, but across the American South, Black radicals rewrite the state constitutions to guarantee Black equality, to guarantee Black citizenship at the state level to the greatest extent that they can. And so I want to zoom in a little bit to look at the case in Louisiana, and we'll look at a couple of Black thinkers there and think through what exactly it is that they wanted and what they saw as a reasonable response to the white supremacy after slavery of Black codes, violence, theft, those sorts of things. So this first, I guess, text is from an Army report, and it's written in January 1868. I think it was January 10th, if I'm remembering right. And this Army officer is reporting to his superior that African Americans, freedmen, have stopped working. And I left the weird spellings in there because, I don't know, things are different. And it's a nice way to remember that. So they stopped working. And they said they're not going to sign any more contracts until the local representative, J.P. Newsham, returns. And it's worth noting here, Newsham was one of 3 people that they voted for in local elections, the first elections ever where Black Americans could vote in the U.S. And they elect 2 Black candidates, and we'll look at who those guys were in a minute, along with this guy, J.P. Newsham, and that's his picture to the right. And the platform that they ran on was a redistributionist platform. Today, we would probably sort of big picture call that socialist. And so we're just kind of using that umbrella term here to think about it. But it's a redistributionist platform. And what they were looking for there was access to land, but also access to capital, access to education, access to wealth and opportunities, things that had been deprived, of not only while Black Americans have been enslaved in Louisiana, but also as we saw after, under the Black codes and the violence that white Americans used to sort of try to reconstitute slavery. So I'm going to, this is what the original document looked like. There's a lot of squinting that goes into reading these, but you can see the section that I pulled from is down here. Freedmen have stopped work and say they are not going to make any contracts. So you're welcome to take a screenshot of that if you want and sort of puzzle out, what's freaking out this Army officer. He's really upset that they won't sign contracts. And on the next pages of the letter, he goes into great detail why. And he pretty much just thinks it's the end of the world. They're not going to sign another annual contract after they hadn't been paid for the first 2 contracts that they had signed. So we're taking a step back. Remember I said that Newsham was elected with 2 Black representatives. One was John Gare. He's a really important figure who helped rewrite the state constitution, and there's no existing picture of him. I've researched every scrap of evidence I can find of his life, and it's very frustrating to me that I can't find an image of him. But I do have a picture of Lewis, Richard Lewis, who was elected alongside him. And so this is Lewis here to the right. And they were elected to help create a new constitution for the state of Louisiana. And the reason that I want to sort of emphasize that is because we're going to take a look at the Constitution and see some of what their demands were. We already saw the land issue. They're really, they're really moved by this idea that they need to have some kind of access to property and opportunity if they're ever, going to be meaningfully free. But beyond that, they're worried about other issues too. And ultimately, the Constitution that they passed was probably the most embracing of civil rights in the country for 100 years. And so we'll look at one article from there in just a moment. Here's a picture on the right of the Black members, many of the Black members who helped rewrite that Louisiana state constitution. There were more, obviously Gare isn't pictured here, but Lewis is. Again, frustrating. This is the only picture of Lewis that I can find. It's just this sketch, right? But I think it does give a sense of, the systems of power and work there. These people who did this work, important work, they weren't wealthy. They didn't have a lot of stuff, and they couldn't afford a lot of pictures. And it also gives a sense to me of the work that historians did, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Because I'm just going to be honest with you, like they were very much, invested in white supremacy, and they didn't want these guys' stories to be told. And so, the little that we knew about them, was thrown out of archives. It was thrown away, it was burned. So it's really hard to kind of piece together their lives and their stories. But what they did was astronomical. They helped write a constitution that established integrated public schools in 1868. Like, wrap your head around that, right? Like, white Southerners and really white Americans even today, are still sort of trying to resist integrated public schools even now, and I read, an article, I guess it was a year ago now, that our schools are about as segregated as they were when Brown v. Board went to the Supreme Court, which is, again, is mind-boggling. But this is something that they thought was important, and it's something that really, honestly, we're still fighting about today. They also, thought it was important to be able to have free and fair elections. Again, something that is contested even now. And I want to zoom in on this article, and you can see it's from the same document. You can Google, if you want to, the Constitution of 1868 and read the whole thing if you want to. But Article 13 was especially important to the Black printer who put together that poster that I showed you in the previous slide. It banned all racial discrimination, basically, not only in public services, but also in private businesses. And so again, this is 100 years ahead of its time. It's something that Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were fighting over 100 years later. Was making sure there was no discrimination in private spaces and private businesses. It's something that in many ways we're kind of still figuring out. And it was something they formerly enslaved people wrote into law. Astronomical. One of them, he didn't work on the Constitutional Convention, but he was a state legislator and later a member of the New Orleans School Board, was Victor Eugene Mccarty. He preferred to go by V.E. Mccarty, and so that's how I have him here. But he was an Afro-Creole, and his mom was from what we would today call Haiti, from Saint-Domingue, which is a colony, had the Haitian Revolution, and it became, the first country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. And so he's kind of a radical thinker in Louisiana at this time, and he worked to integrate the public schools in New Orleans in 1874 and 75. It was incredibly controversial. He received death threats. Someone actually tried to assassinate him. He survives, right? But the work that they're doing, again, is visionary. And, what they see as guaranteeing equality is access to equal opportunity. That doesn't, just mean education. That also means, wealth and capital and jobs. And ultimately, Mccarty had to go into hiding, basically, because of the death threats that he received. He also survived a white supremacist coup. I would be remiss if I didn't mention in September 1874. And this is part of his response to that coup. On the right side here, he and others argued that really it was in white Louisianans' best interest to chill a little bit, to concede equality, to create a state where everyone had access to equal opportunity, to equal employment, those kinds of things. Unfortunately, what happened instead was very different. It was just 2 years later, in the election of 1876, that white supremacists basically kicked out almost all of the last of these reformers in a wave of violence during the election and afterward. And so that's, something that I've been thinking about a lot in the last few months. And it's something I think, that we don't see a lot of in our history classes, growing up, that is really important and helps us make sense of things that we're continuing to grapple with as a country. I want to take a moment and pause and give you a chance to jot down a few ideas from this kind of first generation of Black thinkers, the 1868 group. And so after this little pause, we'll move on and we'll look at two Black radical thinkers, CLr James and W.E.B. Du Bois from the early 1900s. So take a moment, jot down a few impressions, a few ideas from this first group, and we'll go on. All right, if you can start wrapping up, we'll go ahead and move into essentially what comes next in the history, which is Jim Crow. After that election of 1876, what we call Reconstruction formally ends in the American South, and this new white supremacist regime is officially, legally installed and kind of becomes the norm, not only in the American South, but across the whole country. And it's defined by a few different things: by voter suppression, by convict leasing, where people are arrested, almost all African Americans arrested and leased out by the state to private entrepreneurs. It's also defined by redlining, which determined which neighborhoods Black Americans could live in. And eugenics. And so this is sort of like a state response to racist pseudoscience. And so there's a lot of experimenting on Black patients, like the Tuskegee experiments, and also sterilizing Black Americans. So some really awful stuff happens under Jim Crow. And so just like with sort of the Black codes of the early to mid 1860s, you start to see Black intellectuals kind of formulating an intellectual and ideological response to this bad stuff that keeps happening. The first of these is W.E.B. Du Bois. And I wanted to just share this passage with you. It's from the introduction to his magisterial work, Black Reconstruction, which is published in 1934. And he explains in the passage here why his version, why his analysis of Reconstruction, of what happens after emancipation, was a little bit different than all of the other the white scholars who are out there doing this same stuff. And essentially what he says is that he views Black Americans as regular humans. And so if you view Black people as humans, then you're going to find my work to be of value. But if you don't, if you think they're sort of innately inferior, then this isn't really going to do anything for you. And I think it's really interesting that he pinpoints that, because he uses a lot of the same evidence that these white historians do. But he uses it very differently, and you get a sense of what Black Americans must have been thinking, feeling, right? What must have motivated their actions. Something that the white supremacist establishment was in no way concerned with. And so I think it's an interesting passage. Anyway, you're welcome to screenshot it or whatever if you want to save it for later. But this his thinking went alongside CLr James's. James wrote anonymously, wrote this pamphlet, why Black Americans should oppose World War II. And so you can see here that their ideas about both the white supremacist nature of the American state and also the treatment of Black Americans kind of informs their intellectual response to that treatment. And so here James is saying, that there's no reason for Black Americans to fight and die for a country that doesn't recognize them as fully people, as equal even before the law, much less equal in a de facto sense. There's no reason for them to fight and die for a country like that. And so together, and these are two of their famous works. They pinpoint Black revolutions as imagining a different present and a different future for their world. And so for James and for Dubois, they recognize that there is this potential for equality, this potential for a world that's actually better, that's actually even safer for everyone, that's even perhaps more prosperous. But it's one that white Americans have refused to embrace because they feel that it doesn't benefit them. And so their analysis is fundamentally that that race and capitalism, that racism and profit are intertwined, and that only by addressing both together can Black Americans hope to achieve something resembling justice. So I'm going to take a moment again, give you a chance to jot down a couple of thoughts or ideas before we move on to our next group of thinkers in Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, and then in Martin Luther King. And then we'll sort of talk some bigger picture ideas. So a couple minutes, jot down some takeaways for later. All right, so it'll be about wrapping up, and we'll go ahead and move on to our last sort of, problem and responses to the problem. And so we have this ongoing system of Jim Crow that Black Americans during the Civil Rights era continue to struggle against, and for a variety of factors, from the publication of the photo of Emmett Till's, mangled body, and the activism that grew around, the outrage in Black America over the murder of a child, to issues of school. A lot of the school desegregation cases are brought by Black veterans who, essentially say the same thing that CLr James said. It's just that I put my life on the line for this country that doesn't value me, and I want it to at least be better for my kids. And so there's a wave of Black activism in the late 1950s, early 1960s that begins to really make a difference. Things begin to really change, at least according to the letter of the law. And so a lot of these Jim Crow laws that made it legal for white Americans to discriminate, and in fact required discrimination, those go away. In terms of redlining and housing discrimination, there were race restrictive covenants that made it illegal for a white homeowner to sell their house to a Black home buyer. Those laws go away. And so there's a potential there, really, for something very new very different, and much better to come in and fill that void. And I think many of the Black activists in this era of the civil rights movement are frustrated at the pace of change, and they see it as something that is incomplete, something that needs to happen more quickly, and in their immediate lifetimes, that things need to change for the better right away. And so I have here a photo of Ruby Bridges, who was the first person to desegregate the public schools in New Orleans, where I'm from. And this happens all across the country, including in the North, where we don't tend to think of segregation as being an issue, or racism as being an issue, maybe. And yet, in terms of the law and in terms of the treatment of Black Americans, it very much was. And I think it's interesting as we transition to these, last two thinkers, that really, much of what they demand is exactly the same as what this first generation that we covered together of Black radicals demands, which is, really access to quality education, access to equal protection under the law, access to sort of a right to work and have build wealth, and a right to property that had truly been denied to Black Americans at least through the 1960s. And so the first of these, two last set of intellectuals I want to look at is Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think a lot of us, we just had MLK Day, right? And our Freedom School is very much dedicated to King's work and King's legacy. But I think a lot of us, especially in white America, tend to remember King as sort of the nonviolent person, as the dream speech, right? King had a dream, things got equal, things got better, and then everything's okay. And that's, certainly not what happened in terms of King's activism in his life, right? We tend to forget that he was assassinated by a white supremacist. He's assassinated while he's out, during the Poor People's Campaign, giving the Other America speech. And he's assassinated for, ideas that are, I think, much more radical than having a dream, ideas that involve implementing that dream. And so King argues that there are fundamentally, there are two Americas. There's an America that's defined by wealth, that is largely a whiter America. It is an America that is defined by opportunity, where its residents have access to a quality education, quality housing, quality public services. And then there's the other America. And for King, this other America is one that is disproportionately Black. It is an America that is defined by, that is confined in, I guess, low quality housing, with poor education, few opportunities. And this, King says, is not simply an injustice. It is, something that that harms the fabric of society, that makes everyone less safe, that makes everyone less prosperous, and that leaves white America unable to live up to its full potential as an America for everyone. And so King critiques this. He calls it in some places socialism for the rich. He gives various versions of this speech, and so that's from one of them. But that's a line that he used a lot. And I think for King, what he's pinpointing there is, in fact, that the people in the first America, right, where it's whiter and wealthier, aren't really pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, right? They have a lot of government assistance and things like that. Their schools are government run, right? And they have government subsidized housing and loans and things like that. They give them opportunities that are simply unavailable to people who live in the other America, in the Blacker and poorer America. And King says this is simply unacceptable. I want to play a clip. It touches on some of the things that he speaks about in his speeches. And actually, in one version of the Other America speech, there are many, he addresses this exact exchange with this reporter. But I think it's interesting because it shows how King would assess the time in Black America since emancipation. And so I think it works well with our discussion for today. So I'll play the clip, and then we'll look at a few more ideas and we can discuss.
What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are Black?
White America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma. America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its Black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Right. And so I think you can see here King touching on a lot of the themes that we saw our first generation of Black radicals that we looked at today mention: access to land, access to capital, access for a real meaningful opportunity, especially after enslavement, when legally they had been deprived of the right to own things, the right to accumulate property. And so for King, this is an injustice that is born into the fabric of post-emancipation Black life, but then is continuously woven into that fabric by white America. And so I want to look at, all right, well, this is kind of a longer passage. I kind of forgot it was this long, but it's very long and it's okay. You can look at it and there's lots of things to glean from it. But there's a few things I want us to think about here. This is from King's Where Do We Go From Here? This, is out at roughly the same time that he's doing the Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign focused on several different demands. An economic bill of rights, they called it. And one of them is a living wage. One of them, which King talks about here, is essentially a universal basic income for people who can't find a job or who, can't find enough work, right? And he sort of makes that argument for the universal basic income as a sort of an embrace of the dignity of our neighbors and of ourselves as crucial, as essential to an equitable future. in the Economic Bill of Rights, you also have a demand for land, a demand for access to like lending capital, like government subsidized loans that many of us take out to go to school or take out to buy a house today. Those had been unavailable to Black Americans, and they were unable to have access to those bootstraps, if you will. And then finally, access to meaningful representation in the government. And so we see here, King going out, onto the Poor People's Campaign with a really robust series of demands. I think it's hard to disentangle, what leads up to his death in Memphis at the sanitation workers strike in the aftermath there. It's hard to disentangle that from this set of demands that really was meant to help, all Americans who are struggling with poverty and inequality, but especially because of American history, Black Americans. And so I think this is a king that we, at least in white America, see less than the king of a dream and the king of nonviolence. But I think it is one that is compelling and is in this long-standing Black radical tradition. The last intellectual or group of intellectuals I want to look at is the Black Panther Party. It tied heavily to Huey Newton's work, but there are other intellectuals that worked within and then after, out of the Black Panther Party. And one of the things I don't want to forget to mention that defined both of their experiences, both the Black Panthers and also King's, was harassment and surveillance by the FBI. You can Google this later if you want, but the FBI sent King a letter trying to convince him to kill himself. Just lots of awfulness that, again, I think shows that, while we today tend to think of King as not a polarizing figure and one who's widely beloved, by white America, that may be, I guess I'm being provocative here, but, in part because he's dead and he can't speak out anymore about what's happening. The Black Panther Party, just like King, they tie freedom to wealth and opportunity. And this is their famous 10-point plan poster that they distributed when they first put out the plan in 1966. And we'll focus on just really the second point. All of them are of interest, and this is, easily, you can look this up later if you'd like to. But I like the image because for the Panthers, self-defense, armed self-defense, the right to protect themselves with a gun was very much tied to the right to represent and make demands for their community. And so it's sort of interesting, I guess, that we're still dealing with a lot of these same issues today. So the second point, and I have that point here in full, is that they wanted full employment for Black Americans, and while we might as white Americans object to this, I think they have in mind the history that we've just discussed, which is that Black America has very much been held down, penalized, and even plundered by white America. And so, notice they're not saying, white Americans shouldn't have full employment, right? But they are saying that Black Americans, because of that history, for equality to be meaningful, have to have something like full employment. And I hate to qualify their demand here, or to explain it or apologize for it. But I think so often the Panthers get read as scary and as violent. And in many ways, I think that has a lot to do with who has told their story and why. And so, I think it's very important to be very specific about things that they were asking for and things that they weren't. Anyway, aside from the demands of the state to guarantee income or to pay reparations, which is the third point, they also set up programs themselves, programs, in fact, that the state borrowed or co-opted, depending upon who you ask. Free clinics. They set up the first public ambulance service in the country in Pittsburgh. It used to be when you called for an ambulance, it would just sort of be like up to whatever random hospital got the call to decide what that ambulance looked like, what aid they would give, if any, and what neighborhoods they would serve. They put together the ambulance service initially because ambulances wouldn't serve Black neighborhoods. And finally, food assistance. Together we call these things mutual aid. So they put together these programs where members of their community can help one another and their larger community. And so the free breakfast program in public schools today is very much at least influenced by, if not, the direct result of the Panthers program. Historians debate about that all the time, but in terms of scale, in terms of impact, it very much was a Panther program. Sorry, it's just what happened. Anyway, so they set up a bunch of these programs designed to help everyone from their community who had been constrained by a state that really refused to serve their needs and to meet their demands. Those demands that really have been kind of consistent since the end of slavery. Here's another example, and I picked it because Angela Davis is on here, to be honest with you. But again, another kind of mutual aid where they're giving out free bags of groceries, and you can also then sign up to hear their speakers. And another name I want to point out is DeArmey Bailey, who became later a U.S. Circuit Court judge, I think. But he was organized the first sit-ins in Baton Rouge when he was at Southern University. They expelled him for organizing the sit-ins, but ultimately, I feel like he came out on the right side of that. Anyway, I'm gonna stop the screen share and I'll just sort of wrap up with a few, I guess, overarching observations. And then we'll open it up for questions or discussion or both. Right. So there's a few points I want to emphasize, let's say themes, that cut across these multiple generations of Black radical responses to white supremacist policy and white supremacist politics. First, it's worth observing, emphasizing that white Americans erased this history, the one that we discussed today, from white public memory, but it very much informed the consciousness and tactics of Black activists and thinkers. Martin Luther King and Huey Newton both understood that Black history had been overwhelmingly shaped by white violence and plunder. So too did Richard Lewis and Victor Eugene Mccarty in that first generation of thinkers. Their calls for armed self-defense or militant nonviolence that we continue to discuss today are best understood as evaluations of and responses to the history of the white supremacist state. Second, white America tends to treat Black socialism as something new, as the result, and this is because of a mythical, monolithic Black culture that, according to the myth, rejects hard work that's embraced by white America. That's not true. It's a myth. White wealth, according to the mythology, justifies more white wealth. In practice, however, whether in 1868 or 1968, Black socialists point to wealth as the basis for the social production of race and its political reproduction in the racist state. Depriving Black Americans of power, enables white America to deprive Black Americans of further power and the wealth and opportunity that comes along with it. The long Black freedom struggle against the constraints of racial capitalism is thus fundamentally both anti-racist and also anti-capitalist. Finally, we see a resurgence of the particular white supremacist tactics that led to the death and silencing of generations of Black activists. White vigilante violence and judicial connivance. Recognizing these forces at work offers the opportunity to build a better future, to embrace the call to democracy voiced by Black thinkers from Lewis and Mccarty to James and Dubois, to Newton and King, through the present and into our current struggles and their articulation by the Black Lives Matter movement. And with that, I'd like to close and to invite comments, questions, and especially your best laid plans. Thank you.
Hi, so this isn't so much of a question, but it's more of a comment. So I just wanted to say thank you for doing this, because I think at Villanova, like, we are very much consumed in white spaces. So it's nice to hear, like, also coming from like a white professor, you being so invested in something like this. So thank you for sharing your information with us today. But I do have a question. So what kind of drew you to this, like, kind of this research specifically?
Yeah, thank you for the thank you and also for the question. So I guess the long and short of it is, I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and we like to tell ourselves that we're like a town that loves to party, that loves to eat, where everyone gets along. We do love to party, and we do love to eat. Not everyone gets along. There's a story I like to tell that I didn't know until I was an adult. But we have this right next to the zoo, the New Orleans City Zoo. There's a big field, and they use it for parking and sometimes for soccer. And apparently, and like I said, I didn't know this when I was growing up, but it used to be the largest public swimming pool complex in the United States. And the reason that it's not a public swimming pool complex anymore is because a federal judge mandated that it be integrated, that Black children and families be allowed to swim there. And rather than allow that to happen, the city condemned it as, structurally unsound and bulldozed it. And so now there's like one tiny little piece of this building left, and the rest of it is basically a parking lot that sits vacant most of the time. And so I guess, it's a long-winded way of answering your question, but my answer is just that, I grew up not knowing these things, and thinking, that my city was the way it was, because that's just how it had to be. I grew up in a very white privileged space. And so when I learned these things, I just feel like this is unacceptable, and that we need to be having these conversations, especially as white people, and to be talking about this past and present in a real honest, straightforward way.
Thank you.
Well, Daniel has his hand up.
Oh, great, Daniel. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to cut off Ashley. But yeah, thank you as well. I saw the topic of this conversation, and I immediately was like, yeah, I'm going to go to that. So thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, it seems like part of the conversation surrounding Martin Luther King and stuff like that, seems like his history was very whitewashed. And so what is a way that, because also thinking about Malcolm X, like how he's represented, he's seen as like this aggressor, almost. I remember learning in school that there was like a good side and a bad side to it, and that's definitely not the case. And so like, what as like Villanova, like I love the freedom school stuff, but like what is Villanova like, can we do, or like try to extend this out to where we can like get this sort of more prevalent within like the culture here? Because I feel like it's exactly what you said in your answer to Ashley. Like a lot of people are like, oh, this can't change. Like this is just how it has to be. When that's very obviously not the case. It almost seems like the people that whoever's doing this, America or whoever's running it, seems like they almost want this. And they kind of want people to think that this is like, this can't change almost.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and a really challenging one. So I want to especially thank you for asking it. I'll just, I'll just be really honest. Like we have structural issues at our university. Those we need to address those. Where our students and where our faculty come from, we can, make those things a priority. We can, make our institution more representative of our country if we want to. If that truly is a priority, and I guess I'll, take a second to plug an organization that I work with, the Villanova Anti-Racist Alliance, which, is kind of trying to help, among other groups, push the university to be more proactive, I think. I'm being careful here, because for a lot of reasons, right? Obviously, but I think it's obvious that that the university can be doing more to promote an equitable and representative campus environment, and I want them to do that. I think we're all better off. They do.
Thank you so much.
So I'd love other questions if there are any. It's okay if they're not, or expressions of shock or emojis or whatever. I really, I want to thank you for having me today. This has been a real pleasure. And like I said, I think this is something we can discuss for a long time. I think it's also something that I hope we see some real action around. So yeah, are there other thoughts or questions, please?
I have a quick kind of selfish question. How
Sure.
how would a new staff member learn more about the Anti-Racist Alliance?
I email you. Is that okay?
What was that?
Can I email you? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right. Cool.
And can I say one thing, Will? This was
Yeah.
terrific and really provocative, and I love the comments that have been made. But to the last one, or to the people who say, look, you can't change things, and certainly we know that there are still sort of a legacy of white supremacy that is woven into our culture and we're dealing with today, right? But taking it back to Villanova, I've been here a long time, and we have issues, no doubt about it. But we also have become sort of agents for change and things on campus, particularly around issues of race, in the curriculum, in these various organizations, right, have really erupted in the past 10 years. So we've had MLK, since 1990. But as I said, change can be incredibly slow, but nonetheless, there are these sort of pockets of change, and really encourage students, faculty, staff, and faculty can be one of the most recalcitrant in difficult populations, I must say, but be active agents. And this is our community. And in many ways, if we can't do it here, right, in this community, it's going to be more difficult to make those type of changes in society, right? So I thank everybody for this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to knock anybody who's been doing the work.
No.
There's a lot of people who are, and there's still, I think there's very clear things that we can do starting tomorrow, if we really wanted to, and that just means making things a priority, even more than they already are.
Yeah. No, I just want to balance the pain that we still do, if you will.
Yeah.
Individually, institutionally, but we're still making progress, but it's incredibly slow, but it is, so yes.
Well, I think that comment is important to remember, especially because of this idea of like compassion fatigue, where, we're working so hard towards a loftier goal and we can feel like we lose hope if we keep telling ourselves that things are never going to change. So it's just always important to remember. And then this presentation reminded me a lot of the misremembering history one that was, I want to say, 2 sessions earlier. And it was just all about how you have to like be about it in every part of your life. And I feel like this, remembering that change happens, albeit slow, helps you stay in the fight, kind of thing.
Sorry, I just have one more thing. If we wanted to reach out to you, we can email you.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, anyone here, or even, I don't know, people who aren't here, yeah, please encourage them to pummel me with emails. That would be wonderful. And yeah, we can change things. And we if we think nationally, we've seen things change, right? We've seen things get better. We've also seen things get worse. So I think realizing that, we have the opportunity to make the Villanova and to make the America that we want. So let's do it.
And can I add one more thing? Will, forgive me here, but this speaks to Villanova, needless to say. Highly recommend that you folks check out the sub-catalog that we in Peace and Justice offer, because what you can see is the menu of courses that deal with issues of race and diversity, in a myriad sort of collection of departments. And that's part of what I mean. It's like, oh my God, the eruption of different courses addressing these different aspects: sociology, history, literature, economics, whatever. So yeah, it's really exciting, I think, for us as Villanovans, as students, as lifelong learners. So highly recommend that.
Thank you. Well, can I beg one more time for questions or comments before we go? Cool. Well, I want to thank you all for having me, really. This has been a pleasure. And I look forward to continuing the conversation later if you're interested in that. And thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great work, Will. Great work.
Thank you so much.
Get your kids out of the snow
I know.
now.
Yeah. I'll get them some ice cream. Ooh.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
can I just a couple of comments?
Yeah.
And this adds to the discussion and all that, right? I've learned tremendous amount from Malcolm X, and in his, the little book I use, 4 Speeches to End White World Supremacy. The first one is Black Man's History, right? And talking to Black people whose minds have been colonized, right, by white supremacy. He's like, you got to know your history. Yeah. Well, it's like, Lord, that is so true for whites too, right? You've got to see this larger history. And particularly for your own identity, not just in terms of this nice thing called white privilege, but your white supremacy, your violence, right, in the course of this. That's number one. And number two, thinking about, all these voices of critique, reform, that are here, oftentimes in this whitewashing or in a greater attention. This is a quote that was in Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Epistemology, right? And it said, white people got to pity Black people before they can love them. So if it is just you focus in on the violence, the slavery, it's like, oh, that's awful. Mm-hmm. And you don't see the voices and actions of agency. Yeah. That's still capitulating, to ideas of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. So anyway, just want to share thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really great. And, it gives me a lot to think about. So which is always
well,
wonderful.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're doing this work.
Yeah.
And hope to see more of you affiliated with Peace and Justice. It's, as I said, it's a great group of people in its network,
Yeah, well, I would love that. That would be wonderful.
Terrific. It's great for your resume also, your vita. Oh. Well, no, not to be affiliated with us, but have the opportunity to give talks through us.
No, I mean, I enjoy doing this anyway. So I feel odd. I'm doing this work at a time where there's all these massive cuts in higher ed. And so, right. I shouldn't laugh about the resume, but it's just it almost doesn't matter, but I would love to do that just for me, really.
Yeah, so, sure. Yeah, really. And for us,
Yeah, well, sure. Why not?
To Villanova's community and stuff. So we would love to have you talk. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.